Welcome back to Unintended Consequences, episode 47 for July 3rd, 2026, Friday. Let's wrap the week with a story that has a real lesson in it. Smokey Bear urged Americans to stamp out every spark and turned manageable forests into fuel for megafires that now consume the agency's budget. On August 5th, 1910, the Big Burn raced across 3 million acres of Idaho and Montana in 2 days. The scale of that single event, moving so quickly across such a wide area, left federal foresters with a clear impression that fires left to run could overwhelm both standing timber and nearby settlements. It killed 87 people, and that human cost, combined with the visible loss of merchantable wood, shaped how later leaders thought about any ignition at all. 35 years later, the U.S. Forest Service placed a bear in a ranger hat on posters with the command, "Only you can prevent forest fires." The policy that followed treated every ignition as an emergency to be extinguished by 10 a.m. the next day, an operational target that crews were expected to meet regardless of terrain or weather. In the 1910 catastrophe and a series of wartime conflagrations in the 1940s, Forest Service leaders saw the nation's remaining commercial timber stands at risk. They worked through the arithmetic of replacement. If another large fire removed several million board feet of saw timber, the time required for new growth to reach harvestable size would stretch well beyond the planning horizons of mills and rural communities. They concluded that another uncontrolled burn could not be tolerated. In 1935, the agency formalized the 10 a.m. policy, directing every district to have a fire under control by 10 o'clock the morning after it was reported. The rule was straightforward on paper. Crews would marshal whatever resources were available, ground teams, early aircraft, or pack animals, to meet that deadline. Smokey Bear, introduced in 1944 by the Forest Service and the Wartime Advertising Council, translated that rule into a public ethic. Fire itself became the enemy, not merely a tool that sometimes escaped control. At the time, the choice appeared straightforward because the data in hand showed merchantable volume and the immediate damage from high-intensity runs. Commercial forestry, rural economies, and emerging recreation all depended on keeping existing stands intact, rather than letting them burn. Decision makers worked from the best available data on merchantable timber volume and the visible destruction left by crown fires, not from long-term studies of fire's ecological role. Posters, radio spots, and classroom materials reached an estimated 80% of American households by the early 1950s. The Forest Service expanded its firefighting capacity with smoke jumpers, aerial tankers, and a growing network of lookouts. Lookouts provided early detection across roadless country. Smoke jumpers allowed initial attack in places where roads did not yet reach. Tankers delivered retardant that could slow a fire's spread long enough for ground crews to arrive. Annual burned acreage on federal lands dropped from roughly 30 million acres in the 1930s to under 5 million by the 1960s. That reduction meant far fewer small fires were allowed to consume surface fuels each year. Early reports celebrated the policy as proof that aggressive suppression could protect both watersheds and the timber base needed for post-war housing. A few range scientists in the Southwest noted that frequent low-intensity fires had maintained open ponderosa stands, yet their observations remained outside the agency's dominant timber management framework. One might ask whether those early observations could have altered the course if they had been weighted more heavily. But the agency's primary mandate at the time centered on timber volume and watershed protection, not on restoring historical fire intervals. Without the regular, low-intensity burns that had cleared needles and brush for centuries, surface fuels accumulated at rates of roughly 1 to 2 tons per acre per decade in many western forests. Consider what that means over time. After 30 years, the added load could reach 3 to 6 tons per acre. After 60 years, the figure doubles again. The material in question includes fallen needles, small branches, and shrubs that once burned away every few years. When ignitions finally escaped initial attack, they encountered continuous ladders of dead wood that carried flames into the canopy. These latter fuels, small understory trees and standing dead stems, allowed surface fires to transition into crown fires that moved through the tops of larger trees. These crown fires produced heat that sterilized soils to depths of several inches, killing roots and seed banks that might otherwise have supported regrowth. By the 1970s, stands that once supported 40 to 60 trees per acre now held 300 to 600 stems, each competing for the same water and nutrients. The arithmetic here is simple. The same site resources spread across 5 to 10 times as many trunks leaves each tree smaller and more stressed, creating conditions where mortality from drought or insects rises. The 1988 Yellowstone fires, which burned more than 1.3 million acres despite the agency's full suppression effort, marked the first nationally visible demonstration that decades of exclusion had altered fire behavior. Subsequent megafires, the 2002 Biscuit Fire, the 2013 Rim Fire, and the 2020 August Complex, each consumed more than 400,000 acres and released carbon stores accumulated over a century of fire absence. The Forest Service's fire suppression budget, roughly 16% of total agency spending in 1995, rose above 50% by 2020. That shift diverted resources from reforestation and thinning projects that might have reduced future risk. Money spent on engines, aircraft, and overtime could not simultaneously fund the crews needed to cut ladder fuels or conduct controlled burns. In 1968, the Forest Service began limited experiments with prescribed fire in the South and Southwest. The 1976 National Forest Management Act formally recognized fire as a natural process on some lands. Yet the accumulated fuel load made reintroduction difficult. A fire that once would have stayed on the ground now had enough material to climb into crowns even under carefully chosen conditions. Escaped prescribed burns, such as the 2000 Cerro Grande fire near Los Alamos, prompted stricter rules and liability concerns that slowed the practice. Today, the agency treats roughly 3 million acres annually with prescribed fire or mechanical thinning. An estimated 70 million acres remain in need of treatment. Recent legislation, including the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, has allocated new funding for fuel reduction. The scale of the backlog and the narrow window of acceptable weather conditions continue to constrain progress. Suitable days for burning without risking escape are limited to perhaps a few dozen per year in many Western districts. Systems that reward the immediate absence of a visible harm often accumulate the conditions for larger harm later. When success is measured solely by the count of fires extinguished, rather than by the state of the fuel complex, organizations lose the feedback that would prompt earlier course corrections. One might wonder whether simply increasing suppression resources indefinitely could offset the growing fuel loads, but each additional dollar spent on emergency response still leaves the underlying accumulation untouched. The same pattern appears whenever a single metric, student test scores, quarterly earnings, or zero visible homelessness, drives policy without reference to the broader system those metrics are meant to serve. The remaining question is whether institutions can shift resources toward the slower, less photogenic work of restoring process before the next ignition arrives. That's unintended consequences for today. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with a friend who'd appreciate the story. Subscribe wherever you listen, and we'll be back tomorrow with another case. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at Nerra Network, links in the show notes. And before you go, this show is part of the Nerra Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. SpaceX Daily, the daily companion for following SpaceX as a public company, from Starship to the stock ticker. Find every show free at nerranetwork.com. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.